Good morning, everybody. Bob Lazaro here from the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, and I'm grateful that you could join us today on a very important topic that I'm sure a number of you are involved with in your local governments, how to access the federal funds from the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, billions of dollars that are out there for people to take advantage of. I have three things to ask you to think about before I turn it over to Jillian. What are the biggest challenges in acquiring federal funds? Oh, 1 second, I'm going to add somebody in here. What are your challenges in acquiring federal funds? What is your current progress in accessing federal funds through the Infrastructure Act or any other economic funding programs? And what are your initial thoughts regarding the Inflation Reduction Act, and where do you see an opportunity for your local government or regional body to access them? Pleased to turn it over to Jillian, Senior Program Manager with the Climate Group. And I also see Tom Peterson on here as well. So I'm going to go off screen and shut off my microphone. And also, once the presentation is over, if we could go to the full screen, Jillian, and then I can help be traffic cop for any questions for you all. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction to myself and Climate Group in Under 2, and then I'm going to pass over to our partners at Center for Climate Strategies, Tom. So yes, my name is Jillian. I'm Senior Program Officer for Climate Group at the Under 2 Coalition. And what we're doing today is we have a joint partnership with CCS and a project dedicated towards getting subnational governments this targeted assistance for the acquisition of federal funds. And so today we're just going to give you an overview of what exactly this project is and what opportunities are out there and how we can move forward. So with that being said, I'll pass it over to Tom to give a bit of background on the Center for Climate Strategies.
Well, thanks, Jillian. I appreciate that. And welcome, everybody. And Jillian, let me just double check and be sure you got the latest slide deck. If not, you can do a sub, but I'm going to go ahead and take it from here. And then also, Jillian, will you be advancing the slides?
Yes, I will be advancing the slides, and this is the one that Ariana provided yesterday.
Wonderful, thank you. I think many of you know the Center for Climate Strategies, but in case you don't, we're a national, actually international nonprofit organization. We were formed in 2004 very specifically to help states and localities in the United States build consensus around multi-objective solutions to climate change that ultimately could influence national and even international policy, but more importantly, be able to move the needle outside the Beltway between stakeholders and government agencies. And so we have been very active in providing the technical and facilitative assistance, the tools and training, and the thought leadership involved in that process, which is of course now shared very widely, not only in the United States, but worldwide, as we address global needs through the Paris Agreement, but also our domestic needs at many different levels. Our headquarters are in Washington, D.C., although I am physically located here in the city of Fairfax and familiar with Northern Virginia issues quite a bit. Go ahead. A little bit about the project. What we're going to do today, we're going to take a look at the overview of what we're doing in partnership with Jillian and the Climate Group, but also talk a little bit more specifically about the Infrastructure Act, which we will alternately refer to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law as we go through this, and then also the Inflation Reduction Act. We want to have some time for discussion. We want to particularly build, I think, on the questions that Bob raised a minute ago in terms of what's most important to you in terms of going through this journey of accessing these funds, and then talk a little bit about what might happen next, depending on your level of interest. Go ahead. This is an alliance between our two organizations with support from the New York Community Trust of Philanthropy. Just a side note, as a nonprofit organization, one of the things that both of us do is we mobilize funding from the philanthropic sector to be able to provide support in various ways for subnational governments here in the United States. And the climate group actively manages a coalition of subnational governments globally and in North America, the Under 2 coalition that is devoted to addressing the challenges and solutions involved in climate change. And so we have the advantage of working with that network as a part of this, and then reaching out and expanding it as we proceed. Go ahead. Couple key things we're trying to do here is really, number one, get a bead on what the key issues are where assistance is needed. Number two, get a bead on the really high priority uses of funds in terms of policies and programs, and then match that with sources of funds that are available within the federal legislation, but then there are some related sources of funds associated with that. And then to clarify and respond to needs for capacity, coordination, acceleration, and assistance that you might have. Go ahead. What we're trying to do here is work through a series of steps, and we're proceeding fairly quickly, actually, which the project will stretch through the end of April. It may well be extended beyond that. We're working on that now, but we're hoping to identify at least 5 states, regions, and localities to be a nucleus group that we work with here, and provide a series of orientation briefings, and ultimately identify at least 1 to 2 priority programs for each jurisdiction that we can sink our teeth into and provide support for further development and implementation. Part of this involves the matching of funds I just mentioned, and then tracking these federal programs to identify options in terms of sources and mechanisms, and then to mobilize some support here in terms of assessment and technical assistance. Go ahead. And by the end of the day, we would hope to have identified some pretty clear programs and incentives that we can organize around in terms of providing some support. We're actively looking at matching, as I mentioned before, the policies and programs with those sources, providing the guidance and the support needed to close the gaps. We're also really expecting a lot of peer level exchange, learning, and even support here across jurisdictions, including not just states, but regions and localities. Go ahead. Why are we doing this? The climate change problem is very real. The global numbers that you see on this chart are an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. There's a very direct cause and effect relationship that results in the warming of the earth. And then there's a series of things that happen as a consequence of that I think all of you are very familiar with, but it changes our climate profile in terms of heat and cold, our precipitation, sea level rise, wind, and even certain forms of air pollution. And then they drive a series of other changes that affect the everyday lives of people and living things. And so this is a very serious problem. The urgency of this is such that we really need to nail down in this next set of years by the end of this decade the implementation actions that are required to push this number down low. So there's really no time to lose here. And this federal legislation is specifically designed to provide support for infrastructure, but also technology and practices here in the United States that will enable us to implement the programs required to do that. Go ahead. We also recognize in terms of economic recovery that one of the biggest challenges we have in the United States, and it's not just a US issue, is inflation that's related to energy costs, energy prices. And you can see in this graph that energy prices are responsible for the vast majority of change we have in inflation here in the United States. for those of you who track things globally, to give you some sense, in the United Kingdom, the estimates are that about 75%, about 25% of all households in the UK will go into poverty status in the next 2 years as a consequence of energy price increases. So this is really a very, very big issue, and the Inflation Reduction Act is targeted quite specifically to provide some resolution of this. Go ahead. The other major issue is persistent inequities that exist really across the United States and in a number of different ways. We're going to talk a lot more about this, and specifically disadvantaged communities and low and moderate income households as a focal point of the legislation and a major focal point of need as we go forward. Go ahead. Fundamentally, this is all about matching sources and uses. On the sources side, we have within the legislation, both sets of legislation, formula funds that flow through states, competitive grants. We have matching funds for both, but we also have tax incentives, and now we have direct payments. We also have accelerator funding that we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. On the uses side, the breakdowns by sector are energy, buildings, transportation are the focus of this project, and at the state, regional, and local level. And that really boils down to specific policies and programs that governmental agencies and partners are implementing that need support. What happens in between is these two things come together in terms of a funding mechanism. The federal legislation is providing mechanisms, at least as a starting point, but those mechanisms will need further development for actual implementation by government agencies. Go ahead. Just to give you a little bit of data here to put this in perspective. So we've been doing quite a bit of work in the state of Maryland this year on both sets of federal legislation, and want to give you a little snapshot out of the transportation sector. So as I think you know, Maryland has a statewide climate action plan and a set of goals. They were just expanded last year through the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2021. You'll see that red line at the very bottom. It was preceded by a yellow line, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. The blue line at the very top is the business as usual projection of greenhouse gas emissions for the state. So this is a very, very common graph that you'll see for any jurisdiction and any entity, which shows a top line, which is the projection of emissions going into the future, in this case, 2050. And then bottom lines where those emissions need to go in order to address global climate change mitigation needs. And in this case, what we're showing here is the level of effort involved in that reduction that is currently funded by the state in terms of programs that have been identified and are on the books. And that's the narrow green slice at the top. That's how much has been identified clearly in terms of supporting this drop in emissions that needs to take place. Go ahead. And then what you'll see is a second line. That first graph showed you that about 14 billion has been identified, and it's leaving somewhere between 57 and 63 billion just for the prior legislation, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, that has not yet been identified. And this is funding that desperately needs support from both sets of federal legislation. Now, this is just the transportation sector. And you can imagine adding to this the level of funding that has to be mobilized for energy and for buildings at the same time. And you know, all likelihood, it's going to triple this number. So we really are talking about large numbers. We are really talking about short periods of time in which it needs to be mobilized and committed to implementation programs. This project is specifically designed to help facilitate that process. Go ahead. As we have been working through this project and other projects with counties and cities across the United States, and then in particular in Maryland, a couple of things have come forward here in terms of common and chronic needs that have been expressed. And I think this goes back, to the question that Bob asked. And I think we'd like you guys to give your thoughts on this in just a minute. But a couple of the things here that are coming up regularly are the need for assistance in getting access to information. There's quite a bit of information out there. On the other hand, being able to pinpoint the best available information that's most critically needed has been a tough process for a lot of jurisdictions. I think there's also been a lot of interest in being able to exchange information across jurisdictions to try to accelerate learning. Also, the need for expert technical assistance, planning and assessment, and then program and project development have been the two big things that have come up regularly. Then there's the issue of coordination, particularly multi-jurisdiction grant applications. And the competitive grant process is likely to favor awards that go to multiple jurisdictions in block. And obviously that requires a significant level of coordination around that. It may well be something that in Northern Virginia could be a very attractive option for you to consider. But also the interaction with state and federal agencies. The reality of these laws is that a lot of clarification and a lot of feedback and interaction is required at both levels by localities, and that is going to continue. And it obviously raises the question mark of whether some joint process for you would increase the effectiveness of those interventions and those interactions that take place. But what happens in the future in terms of the actual guidelines is going to be influenced by those communications that take place now and on an ongoing basis. This has been a very big issue. Capacity limitations have been significant. The concern about what's involved with grant applications, and then the ongoing management of grants, because there's a significant burden there. The development of new program mechanisms. This is a key issue because both sets of legislation are encouraging, if not requiring, innovation in terms of programs. Also, just the physical realities of program implementation are burdensome and a concern. There's a very huge interest and actual concern about complying with the Justice 40 requirements. These are across the board in the Infrastructure Act. We have a separate set that's expressed a little bit differently in the Inflation Reduction Act, but very significant issues in terms of identifying eligibility for jurisdictions for disadvantaged communities and low and moderate income households, so that you can actually be qualified to pursue the funds, and then be able to physically set up the targeting and tracking mechanisms to meet these requirements that can be expressed in the applications for funding, and they will be required per se. So this is a significant issue. I mentioned innovations. The legislation is very much designed to support and in some cases mandate innovations. Some of the key things here that are now available, there's the National Green Bank Accelerator and the opportunity for localities working with states in particular, but other entities to access those accelerator funds. Longer story, but that's a very significant new development. But the other thing that's worth noting is that many of the programs, particularly in the infrastructure law, are traditional, conventional funding programs that have been designed to accommodate and encourage, and in some cases mandate, non-conventional approaches, new approaches. Particularly, the call out would be for surface transportation, where that funding is now available for a much broader use in terms of transportation alternatives, active transportation, public transport, et cetera. And the intention of the law is exactly that. So it raises, the need for designing and implementing alternatives to the conventional approaches in these areas. We also have direct pay options, which is just a massive new development that complements tax credits, so that tax exempt entities now get to play ball on equal footing. And then there's the issue of leveraging funds from public and private sources as you go through these funding procedures. And that gets back to the use of a green bank type mechanism to be able to multiply the funding levels that are available. I think that the long-term point on that is that this legislation recognizes that this is going to be a one-shot deal, a one-time infusion of federal funds. It needs to be used as a bridge to structure the mobilization of private investment and other forms of investment and revenue generation in the long term. So as we're seeking these funds directly right now, they need to be structured to be able to transition to blended sources of funding in the future that anticipate the removal of these funds in the future. So these have been some of the big issues that have come up. Yeah, I think you can go to the next slide. I think we're very interested in taking a quick time out here and maybe getting your reaction to where you see some of the biggest challenges and needs at large on federal legislation, and then we'll take a slightly sharper look at the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. But maybe let me just stop right here and invite reactions you might have to some of the challenges that you're facing in terms of the federal funding at this point. Feel free to just call it out or drop a line in chat, and maybe Bob, you could facilitate response to that if folks drop anything in chat.
Yep, happy to do that, Tom.
Anybody want to call out your number one concern?
This is Stephanie Kupka from the city of Fairfax. Our biggest challenge is staff capacity.
And Stephanie, is the staffing for the application process, for the program that follows, for all of the above?
Yeah, basically all phases. So researching the grants, applying for them, and then implementation.
And I always say in chat, Chris from Leesburg has the same issue, staff resources to identify and manage the grants. And then Julia from Prince William, resources and time pulling together the applications. And then from Round Hill, project scale for small municipalities. So on the line, we have some of our smaller members, Percival, Round Hill, and you have some of our larger jurisdictions that have a little bit more resources in that area. So just wanted to let you know what was in the chat.
Well, and we have, thank you, Bob, because we have both small and large jurisdictions, and it sounds like there are probably some common challenges, but then some differentiated challenges between them as well. And particularly small jurisdictions are what we have heard in the past, really kind of facing an avalanche here in terms of being able to sort through, how to work with these federal programs.
Hey, Bob, this is Chip Goyette with Inova. Is it okay to pipe in here?
Absolutely, Chip.
Okay,
Absolutely.
great. Thanks. So I'm obviously with Inova Health System. We're a nonprofit in the region, very large employer, lots of buildings, lots of impact, right? And so we feel, kind of lucky that Bob has invited us into these conversations, to see if there is an opportunity for a nonprofit like us to basically work with the local jurisdictions or folks like yourself to get work done, right? And so, well, I guess my question to you is, in any of your models, or in particularly the regional approaches that you're taking, are you inviting, say large nonprofits in to participate in with this, or how could that work, I guess is the question.
Well, so this project is focused on the jurisdictions in terms of the per se project members. However, both the infrastructure funding and grants in particular, and then the Inflation Reduction Act incentives are structured to bring non-governmental entities in, either in partnership with counties and cities or directly by having direct access. So the competitive grant applications in particular are, we understand, going to very heavily favor partnerships between jurisdictions and private organizations, the nonprofit sector in particular, but are really going to be looking essentially at public-private partnerships, as well as looking at multi-jurisdiction awards, and the two combined. We just parenthetically, we're expecting to see a wave of guidelines come out. The actual date has been set at November 15. We'll see if that sticks, but what we're hearing is that they're going to say that. They're going to say we want folks to be working together jointly. Chip, the other thing to recognize is that in the Inflation Reduction Act, now nonprofits can get direct access to what previously were just essentially commercial tax incentives by going through the direct pay option process. So you do just the same thing anybody else would do in order to obtain a tax credit. But the way you do it as a nonprofit is you file your expenses, and then you get a direct reimbursement, literally a check from the IRS to support it at the equivalent tax credit level. Let's just say that's going to be about a 30% cost subsidy level. So you have the option to go direct, as well as going into partnership to the, and this project is designed to provide some real clarity around those, both of those options, really through the lens of cities and counties and other municipalities.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you.
Knowing that we only have an hour for this presentation, Tom, I think we should proceed with the next.
Great, thanks. Jillian? So we're going to skip through the Infrastructure Act again. This is also being called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Go ahead. And as I mentioned, a couple of key objectives here that overlap. The idea is to put in place programs that do all of these things at the same time. I would just say, that as an institution, the Center for Climate Strategy has focused since its inception on multi-objective approaches to climate change. That's exactly what we're talking about here. So there's a pretty well-established toolkit and evidence base for doing this that we can help you bring forward. I'm sure you're doing this already. Go ahead. As I mentioned, both formula funds and then competitive or discretionary grant programs. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Go ahead. So there are really big cross-cutting considerations in the infrastructure law. Workforce development is a major focus, and so you will see the funding include requirements for workforce development and diversity, and that shows up again in the Infrastructure Act. I mentioned equity and literally the Justice 40 program, and this is being expressed in terms of requirements for 40% of either the funding or the benefits of funding going into disadvantaged communities. These disadvantaged communities are defined by a set of criteria. And where this is going now is actual geographic mapping to identify eligible communities based on one or more of those criteria. So the mapping drill is a very big one. In some cases, some states are putting in place standard maps that localities can use, and in other cases, they're not. There's a lot more that we can talk about here in terms of how to go about doing that. But you will need to be able to demonstrate that you will be serving a disadvantaged community, again, defined in one or more ways, with 40% of the funds or benefits. If you happen to be a jurisdiction where that might be difficult, this is a real incentive to join forces with a much broader set of jurisdictions, so that in combination, that assurance can be made, but then it would enable the individual jurisdictions to really move forward as a part of a block grant, for instance. Rural communities are covered. This legislation and the disadvantaged communities definitions include not only urban populations, but dispersed populations with common conditions. And there are a number of very specific rural programs involved here. As I mentioned before, matching funds are common across the board. In some cases, those traditional levels have been changed. They've been waived in some cases or altered in other cases, but matching funds are typically required. But also, in order for the funds to flow, states and even federal agencies have to do their job in terms of meeting some high-level deadlines. They have to issue plans, guidelines, commitments, et cetera. There's a lot of dialogue underway between localities and states and federal agencies to encourage and enable them to meet those deadlines in a way that will move the money. And this is a major part of this legislation. Go ahead. My organization was one of the two lead contractors to DOE under the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. It's been a dozen years ago now, to help states, tribes, and localities put in place financial mechanisms to mobilize funding then. That model has changed. Rather than DOE and DOT and the other agencies contracting that out, they are directly providing technical assistance and technical resources to support applicants. So you will see an awful lot of technical assistance programs now by the federal agencies. It's really quite remarkable how much they've mobilized around it. And then you're seeing other technical resources. And really the good news is that there's quite a lot of technical resources out there. The bad news is there's a lot of technical resources, and it's a bit difficult at times to sort through, which to use and how best to use them. But this is really a major feature of this infrastructure law. Go ahead. So just to do a quick check on the infrastructure law itself, we'll do the Inflation Reduction Act in a moment, but it would be great maybe to pick up on the conversation we had just a moment ago and see if there are any particular experiences that you're having right now with this infrastructure law that would be worth calling out in terms of areas that might, be suitable for some additional support. And I know many of you have been just also, working through the ARPA funding as well, and now transitioning into this next set, but would be very curious to know how that's going and where there's some particular issues that need assistance.
Hey, Tom, if I could ask a question, just because I've heard it a couple of times, is while the states have gotten money for electric vehicle charging along the interstates, there is local money available in the IIJA for local charging. So folks like my former neighbors in Percival, Round Hill, and others, I think may be interested. Is it possible to work through your organization to be able to apply for it?
Well, we are actually, as a part of this project, doing a transportation briefing tomorrow that will go through all of that. We're marching through sector by sector. So the answer is yes. As you all might know, the states have put together, in response to federal request, NEVI plans, National Electric Vehicle Incentive Programs, to be administered at the state level, and been given a block of funds. I'm not sure what Virginia's level is. I think it's 70 or 80 million. I know it's like 62 in Maryland. But
I think they got 100. I think they got 100.
They got 100.
And then there's a question here from Leesburg. Does that require public charging, or can it be charging for agency fleet only? I know a number of local governments are looking to convert some of their fleets to electric.
Yeah.
Can you include a link to the training for tomorrow?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all of the above. And then separate from NEVI, there are additional EV charging infrastructure programs. Turns out one of my brothers is actually working on this down in Alabama and doing a joint project with the state, with Mercedes-Benz, and with a local community to put in place what we used to call a truck stop, but we've got a new term for that now. That's within a transportation corridor that's located in a disadvantaged community. So you can just imagine how the dots can connect here. But yeah, let's talk about that more in terms of the briefing we do tomorrow, and then follow up, because it's an enormous opportunity.
I don't see anything else, Tom, so I would suggest we keep moving.
Yeah, let's hop on to the Inflation Reduction Act then. So this is a different animal altogether, and we were so very pleasantly surprised to see it finally materialized. It earlier was known as the Build Back Better legislation. Go ahead, Jillian. This shares objectives, but in this case is really sharpened in terms of energy cost and inflation reduction, and also a focus on low and moderate income. The other big call out here is on workforce diversity. Go ahead. 369 billion just in tax credits and direct pay. This is moving very quickly. We'll look at the different components here, but we're expecting guidelines from the IRS on the tax credit and direct pay side of this, frankly, any day now. And then in the not too distant future, guidelines under the National Green Bank Program, and that's going to be split into funding that heads a couple directions. One gets peeled off to go to state designated entities, green banking entities, and other associated intermediaries. Then the rest is going to flow through another process. But point here is this is moving very, very quickly, and it's a lot of money. Go ahead. The tax credits and direct pay. So you're going to see familiar tax credits here and then some new ones, and you're going to see this option, as I mentioned earlier, for tax exempt entities to directly play ball here. So if you happen to be a jurisdiction that's concerned you might not have access to funding because of disadvantaged community requirements, you can nonetheless work through the direct pay option. Local governments, nonprofit organizations, other tax exempt organizations can now play directly into this. Again, this is a very large pool of money, 369 billion. It has requirements that we expect to see spelled out shortly, in many cases for low income targeting. We also see workforce diversity requirements that we'll be expecting. There is a provision for Buy America that's spelled out here. So there's some strings attached. There's a lot here on the electric vehicle side. And Bob, one thing just to call out on the EV side. So the other side of the equation here is purchase incentives that then are designed to match up with the charging stations. But one of the things that happened here, and it happened not just because of Joe Manchin, but predominantly, was to expand eligibility for used electric vehicles and lower cost electric vehicles that are accessible to lower and moderate income people, so that we've really expanded, the spectrum here in terms of EV purchasing incentives pretty significantly. A lot here in the tax incentive and direct pay side. Go ahead.
And as a follow-up to that, Tom, is direct pay eligible for our local governments or like Innova to purchase electric vehicles?
Well, it is. And so direct pay is eligible, interestingly enough, for broad spectrum tax exempt, but actually taxable entities, utilities can opt. They now have the financial flexibility to opt for a direct pay instead of a tax credit if it works best for them. So this is an incredibly flexible mechanism, huge opportunity to blend this with other programs. In fact, you can blend it with your competitive grant application so that you get this incentive stream flowing at the same time.
Thank you.
Go ahead. More grants and loans, they will go through the same track, we believe, as the other infrastructure funding going through DOE, DOT, USDA, et cetera. We'll hear more about it, but a lot more here in terms of electric vehicles and energy efficiency for buildings in particular. Go ahead. The National Green Bank Accelerator. So outside of the United States, we've seen central banks and other national institutions put in place these investment banks that are designed to support sustainable and clean energy related investments. In the United States, this has been included in the legislation, 27 billion, and it will be administered in part by EPA and then also a national green bank that is going to be putting in place guidelines in terms of how to then move money from that apparatus to state and local intermediaries, and then also direct investment in large infrastructure projects. 7 billion of this is administered by EPA through a greenhouse gas reduction fund that will go then to state designated entities for further disbursement through financial mechanisms. And that typically involves both directly placing those funds, but also placing them with debt equity, gifts and grants from other purposes. So this is the world of blended finance that is being supported by the legislation. There's a lot of money here, a lot of opportunity. This is designed not only to flow through existing, I'm calling them green banking entities, but really clean energy investment entities, but also to be able to form new entities. I know this is an issue in Northern Virginia. Just parenthetically, we are working very closely with the Maryland Clean Energy Center to launch their climate change fund, their C3 fund, that is going to be a part of this. So we're very heavily involved in the process right now of helping to form and implement one of the funds that's going to be associated with this, but it's designed to support that kind of capacity building and implementation across the board. It also includes enabling environment support, planning, assessment, et cetera, that is necessary to integrate policy and investment programming at the local and state level. Go ahead. Defense production is included in this. Heat pumps in particular, another key opportunity here. Go ahead. And a number of specific programs and provisions for environmental justice. Some of this is back to block grants and other direct funding opportunities, but then also investment tax credits. So for instance, the wind, the offshore wind tax incentive would be an example of one that has a 10% bonus for the inclusion of environmental justice provisions. But there's a stack here for environmental justice that's included in the legislation. Go ahead. And as I mentioned, rural communities, agriculture, forestry, even waste, biomass, et cetera. But there is very clearly a focus on rural communities here as well. Go ahead. So, Bob, I think that's the tour, if you will, on the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think it'd be helpful here again to see if anybody has any immediate reactions or thoughts on where this could be helpful and what that might mean more specifically.
Sure. Maybe we could ask Jillian to take down the slide so I can see a bigger piece of the screen. That would be helpful. Super. Thank you very much, Tom. I guess my question to you, Tom, and to your organization is how do we connect with you to help folks figure out what makes sense for them? We saw a number of people on here saying, look, we don't have the staff resource to be able to research and or apply. And so that would be number one. And I think a very, very big help, especially for some of our smaller localities. And I just want to clarify briefly for a question. So as I understand it, that a local government that was perhaps looking to convert some of their passenger vehicles to electric, they obviously were not eligible for a tax credit, but under direct pay, they would be able to get that same value in the tax credit for their vehicles. Am I correct in that?
I believe so, but I think we need to confirm that. I know that the
Okay.
intent of direct pay is precisely that. We
Okay.
haven't seen the guidelines from
Okay.
IRS that will be the confirmation of that. That's an any day
Okay.
thing now. So we're
Okay.
going to watch that, but we should double check that, Bob.
And is that the same for solar? So if I have a parking garage, probably not eligible for a PPA, but or a PPA, but if I make that investment myself, a direct pay would rebate back 30%. Is that already set, or is that waiting on the IRS as well?
Well, that's listed in the legislation, but waiting for guidelines from IRS. And I would just say that in particular, community solar was a driver for the direct pay as well as the accelerator funding, just to give you some sense of the thinking around solar.
Okay.
Bob, to the earlier question about how to participate, I think what this project has done is really create a platform for a set of jurisdictions to be able to participate and then work together to, accomplish kind of the end goals here that we talked about earlier. I think in the case of states is state jurisdictions that are, becoming members of this project. And in terms of, much larger local entities, the same. For instance, Oakland, California would be an example of that. But this is also open for a regional coalition. Theoretically, if the Northern Virginia region wanted to become a member of this and a participant in the project, and then be able to accommodate the expression of interest by individual jurisdictions through that we could then work further on. That would certainly be an opportunity. I know we've had an expression of interest from at least one jurisdiction to be able to work directly with the process. But I think, we're looking at this stage, for an expression of interest that then we could then act upon in terms of implementing the project.
Okay, well, we should have a conversation offline about what that means and what you would need from us. I mean, certainly in the past, we've served as an umbrella. Our Solarize program is certainly an example of that being an umbrella project that our local governments then can participate in and take advantage of. So certainly we would like to be able to accommodate the ability for especially our smaller jurisdictions in taking advantage of these federal funds. Some of our larger organizations probably already are. And then we have folks like Innova, who I think would probably be interested in partnering as well. We can have that conversation. I'll ask Dale to follow up with you, but what does that entail and how do we make that happen to the benefit of everybody?
Great.
Dale gave me a thumbs up, so that's fine. Is there any other questions or comments for Tom? Okay, so you want to do something on a regional basis for Northern Virginia and then have people join in as they see a need. So whether you're in Round Hill or Purcellville, who are not members, or some of our member organizations, they could join up.
Well, yes, and Bob, first off, let me invite Jillian and Ariana to expand on the question mark of how to participate in just a moment. But I think what I'd really love to flag also is the opportunity for identifying some common needs that exist in jurisdictions, whether they're small or large, and how those could become a couple of the high priority programs that we sink our teeth into, so that it would enable jurisdictions to get out in the business of trying to reinvent the wheel, for things here. And if ever there was a time when we don't want to do that and instead want to put in place, the opposite, I think it's a real opportunity. The other thing I would just like to underscore, we haven't seen the guidelines yet, but we are certainly hearing, we're hearing this from large counties and other places, the expectation that multi-jurisdiction applications for competitive grants are going to be favored. And I would just, kind of flag that as a possibility here. The other thing that we didn't talk about, but will come up in the transportation briefing, just to be aware, is there is one of the programs is providing an opportunity for the development at a statewide level of a low carbon transportation plan that specifically requires conferral and inclusion with local entities as a part of its development. That plan then results in the specification of a series of funding projects at the local and state level going forward. It's just another example of how this thing is all teed up for multi-jurisdiction participation in these awards. And Bob, as you and all your members know, that's a piece of work, and we're very sensitive to that.
Okay.
Jillian, Ariana, anything you would add with regards to the project itself and the participation of interested folks?
Julian, you want me to go first? Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I joined a bit later due to a previous call. So I think, definitely, if you are interested in a regional coalition to come in and work with us, that would be wonderful. But I also want to make clear that if there are individual jurisdictions with some specific needs and they want to be part of these, have like some targeting support, we would be happy to do that as well. I mean, we have a limited project in terms of resources and timeline, so we need to accommodate that. So I think as the sooner we are able to know who and how you would like to engage, the better. But we are open to any kind of partnership that makes most sense and can be most beneficial.
Okay. So bigger is better, but we have some jurisdictions that may have a specific need that they could talk to you directly.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think in terms of next steps, in order to get the most reach out of everyone that's participating, is if, Bob, you could send the participation list and the registrants for this meeting over to either myself or someone at CCS, but preferably me. It would be fantastic to send out an interest form to all of these participants about what exactly they're looking for. And we could even potentially match jurisdictions that have similar priority programs. And so we can move forward and have bilaterals and one-on-ones to ensure that these needs are being met so we can really get the ball rolling. For me, that would be probably the most effective way to really reach everyone, is to send a mass email with next steps.
Okay. See, this was not set up as a webinar, but as a meeting, so I may have to look at the video and take names and match up email addresses. But I would ask folks who are on, let me put it to you this way. If you're on here now, please send me an email. You know how to reach me, saying, hey, we're interested. And I will then forward it on to Jillian, so she'll be able to get out some information to you. And I see Mr. Dooley, yes, there will be a link for the recording. We'll upload it to our YouTube channel and get that done as well. It's not a problem. Be happy to do that.
I'll also pop in here. I'm going to put my email address directly in the chat as well. If you want to skip a step and directly reach out to me, that's more than welcome. And we would just like to hear from all of you, whatever's easiest for you.
Okay. Thank you, Jillian. I mean, and just from what I'm reading in local newspapers and some of the questions, there's an interest in electric fleets, electric fleet charging, whether it's public or for fleets on their own. I think that's one big issue. I mean, for Northern Virginia, nearly 40% of our greenhouse gases for the region are in the transportation sector. So how do we decarbonize that? And how do our local governments take advantage of some of the benefits? And so IRS rulings will be really important to that question, Tom, in terms of fleet, et cetera. So that's fine. If you all reach out to Jillian directly, that's great. If you want to think about it, then reach out to me. Today's Wednesday, so maybe by Friday, so I can let Jillian know. And then we will put up the YouTube video so you all can take a look at it. There's some statewide organizations on here, Tom, so they may be interested in doing a similar presentation with their local government members from the more rural areas of Virginia. So as you said, there's an interest in helping rural communities as well. So I was going to ask, does anyone have any further questions, comments? Tom, I'll leave it to you to close. I appreciate everyone being on today. I think it was really, really helpful. There's going to be some tight guidelines on these grants, as I understand it, and requirements. So I think the sooner than later will be the best option in how you're going to move forward on all this stuff.
Well,
and I see, by the way, Michelle Gowdy, who's executive director of Virginia Municipal League, said they're very interested in the similar presentation. Thanks, Michelle. It's really important. They represent folks up and down the Commonwealth. So,
well, and we've worked with their counterpart in Maryland extensively, so we'd be happy to do that. Well, first, thank everybody for carving out time. I know everybody's awfully busy, and that's part of the problem here. Also, we look forward to following up, but then, Bob, to your point in terms of, deadlines that'll be fast moving and all that, honest to God, we wish we had the answer to every single question right now about how all of this is going to work, but we don't. I don't think anybody does, to be honest. I don't think the federal agencies even have all the answers. We're going to have to just kind of stick with this thing. And that's the reality of it. And it's going to unfold. And as we do that, we're going to have to kind of forecast forward where we think this is going and get ready. So readiness is a big issue. And we're going to have to be nimble in terms of how to respond to this. And I think that's just the nature of the beast here. And so, the concept of us being able to maybe work together on a continuous basis is something that we wanted to put in place.
Okay, super. Hopefully people will email you, Jillian, and when I get emails, I will let you know, and I will share the link to the video as soon as I get it uploaded. And perhaps you all can send me also the presentation if that's possible. That way we can share it with those folks who were unable to join us.
Thanks, everybody, so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us. And we look forward to being in touch.
Take care.
Bye-bye now.